The windows rattled first. Not from wind. The morning was still, overcast, one of those gray Oregon Tuesdays that smells like rain that hasn't decided yet. The glass in the outer office of the Salem Veterans Affairs Regional Benefits Office rattled because 87 people were crossing the parking lot at the same time, and they were walking with a particular kind of purpose that has a weight to it you can't name until you've been near it. They came through both entrances. No one led, no one spoke. They were men and women in jeans and flannels and work boots. Some in their 30s, some in their 60s, one in a wheelchair, navigating the ramp with the automatic efficiency of someone who had been doing it for years. One man walked with a cane that looked like it had seen a lot of miles. 3 others had the specific posture that develops in people who have spent extended time carrying gear on one side of their body. None of them looked lost. None of them had appointment slips. They filled the lobby. They filled the waiting area. They lined both side corridors and stood without fidgeting. A clerk at the front desk picked up her phone, put it down, picked it up again. The security officer near the entrance said something quietly into his radio and received no useful guidance in return. The regular clients, the veterans with actual appointments, the family members clutching folders, stepped back and made room without anyone asking them to. Supervisory Benefits Claims Officer Barry Quist was in the process of initiating a formal account suspension when the noise, or the not noise, the absence of the ordinary sounds of a building doing its ordinary work, reached him. He stopped typing and looked through the glass partition of his office. The hallway beyond was full of people he did not recognize. And then, through the far entrance, a woman in hospital scrubs walked in. If you're hearing this story for the first time, stay with me until the end. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from. I've been amazed by how far these stories travel. Tova Renn was 32 years old. She worked the overnight shift in the emergency department at Mercy Coast Regional Hospital, 47 miles from Salem, and she had been there since 6 p.m. the night before. She had not slept. She still had a strip of medical tape on the back of her left hand from where she'd reached past a patient's IV line at approximately 4 a.m. and hadn't bothered to peel it off. Her hair was up in the way it gets at hour 13 of a 12-hour shift when the elastic has loosened and you've stopped noticing. She walked through the 87 people who had arrived before her, and every one of them she passed turned slightly toward her. Not a salute, not a formal acknowledgement. Just the kind of orientation that happens between people who have occupied the same difficult spaces and know each other by a quality that doesn't have a clean civilian translation. She had left the hospital 40 minutes early. She had called in a favor to cover her last half hour. The morning had started the way bad mornings tend to, without ceremony. Nolan Renn was 15, tall in the way teenagers get when they grow faster than they expect to, with his mother's habit of watching a room before entering it. He had eaten a bowl of cereal at 7:15, packed the folder his mother had organized the night before, color-coded tabs, documents in sequence, a handwritten note on the inside cover that said if anyone asks for supporting documentation, it's all here in order, and taken the 8:10 bus to Salem because his mother was already 3 hours into her shift and wasn't available to drive. She'd told him it would be straightforward. Show the folder. Answer questions. The account had been flagged for what the notice called a verification irregularity, which sounded bureaucratic and temporary and like the kind of thing that a human being sitting across a desk could resolve in 20 minutes. It became less straightforward approximately 6 minutes into his appointment with Barry Quist. Quist was in his mid-50s, with the bearing of a man who had spent a long time in a position of moderate authority and had confused duration with expertise. His office had a framed letter of commendation behind his desk, positioned so it was the second thing you noticed after him. He opened Nolan's folder. He scanned the first page. He looked at Nolan over the rim of his reading glasses in the way people do when they're about to explain something they expect you to find embarrassing. Your mother's service record, he said. It carries a classification designation I cannot access through any system this office uses. I know, she served in a specialized unit. Quist set the folder down with the particular care of someone who wants you to understand they are being deliberate. What your mother's file claims about the nature of her service is, He chose his word, irregular. It's classified. That's a convenient thing to call a record that can't be verified. Nolan had the specific internal stillness that develops in children who grow up in houses where things go unexplained. Not the stillness of someone who has given up, the stillness of someone who has learned to wait. He felt it come over him now, the controlled patience he'd practiced without knowing he was practicing it. Her discharge is honorable, he said. That's verifiable. The discharge I can see. It's the preceding 9 years I have questions about. Quist closed the folder. There are documented cases of inflated service records. I'm not saying that's what this is. I'm saying what this is requires further examination. The word he used 3 minutes later was misrepresentation. He said it the way people say things they have said many times before, in this room, to this kind of person, and who have not yet been called to account for it. I'll need to place a formal hold on the account pending a complete documentation review. Nolan did the math on his mother's 2 prescription medications and came up with a number he could not subtract from their monthly budget without something collapsing. He kept his voice even. How long does a hold last? It varies. Quist was already turning to his keyboard. You're welcome to wait in the lobby while I process the paperwork. Can I call her? You can do anything you'd like. You're not being detained. He said detained the way you'd say it to someone who hadn't thought to use that word, as a reminder of the distance between what was happening and what could happen if things went a certain direction. Nolan called twice. The first call went to voicemail. She was with a patient in Bay 7 with a cardiac question that couldn't wait. The second connected after 1 ring, but the voice on the other end wasn't hers. It was calm, efficient female. She'll be there soon. Then the call ended. He sat in the plastic chair in the waiting area and stared at his phone and thought about all the things he had spent 15 years not asking about. His mother had 3 scars she'd explained to him and 2 she hadn't. The explained ones were fine: a burn from a camp stove, a cut from broken glass, an appendectomy scar from before he was born. The 2 unexplained ones were on her right shoulder and left calf, and he had learned by the time he was old enough to notice them properly that asking felt like opening a door he hadn't been given permission to open yet. She checked the locks twice before bed. She parked facing out of every lot. She never sat with her back to a restaurant entrance. He'd filed all of it under Mom is careful and left it there, because the other file, the one that explained these things differently, required him to know a version of her he hadn't been given. He was still sitting with the folder in his lap when the windows in the waiting area rattled. He looked up. The lobby had changed. The people he'd registered on the edges of his vision, the man in the wheelchair, the woman with the cane, the younger ones who had the quietness of people who have spent time being very loud in very loud places and have learned to conserve it, were arranged through the building with a coherence that had no visible explanation. They were not in rows. They were not standing at attention. But the space they occupied was not random. And then Tova Renn walked through the entrance, and Nolan understood something he hadn't known how to ask. She came to stand in the doorway of Quist's office. She didn't knock. She sat down beside Nolan in the second chair, which Quist hadn't offered, and she placed a phone on the desk between them. Matte black. No carrier logo. A small numerical keypad, the kind of device that has a specific purpose and doesn't apologize for it. When it rings, she said, answer it. I'm not going to, Quist began. The phone rang, 1 flat tone, a pause, another flat tone. Quist picked it up. He listened for 52 seconds. Nolan counted. His mother sat with her hands in her lap and did not look at the phone and did not look at Quist and did not look particularly like someone waiting for anything. Quist said, yes, ma'am. Then, after a pause, yes, ma'am. Then, quietly, a 3rd time, something that was less a sentence than a sound, the specific noise of a person understanding the full dimensions of a mistake they have made. He set the phone down and looked at his desk. Clear the hold, Tova said. Full retroactive coverage from the freeze date. Remove the verification notation from the account record. The classification, Quist began. The classification is why you can't see it. That's not a flaw in my documentation. That's the system working as intended. She said it with the patience of someone explaining something for the last time, not the first. He typed for 9 minutes. He printed 2 forms. He signed and stamped them without eye contact, and when he slid the paperwork across the desk toward Nolan, he stopped and actually looked at the boy. Not at his folder, not at the claim number, but at him. I said some things today that I shouldn't have said. I made assumptions. Nolan picked up the forms. He folded them exactly in half and tucked them into the folder. He took his time doing it. You should think about who you say misrepresentation to, he said, because someday they're going to be standing right there when you say it, and that's going to be a harder conversation than this one. He said it without heat. He was 15 and he had his mother's eyes. Outside, the 87 people were dispersing into the parking lot. A man in his late 40s with the forearms of someone who had spent years doing difficult physical work paused near the entrance ramp, and when Tova came through the doors, he dipped his chin once. She returned it. 2 syllables in a language that didn't use words. How long, Nolan asked. Did it take you to arrange that? Tova looked at the thinning parking lot. I started making calls when I got your first text, before I left the hospital. His first text had been sent at 9:47 a.m. She'd been in the middle of documenting a wound assessment. He thought about his mother standing at a nurse's station at 9:47 in the morning, reading a text from him that said claims officer is being difficult with the paperwork, and already reaching for something she had apparently been maintaining quietly, in whatever parallel track of her life existed alongside the overnight ER shifts and the grocery runs and the biology homework she'd helped him with twice last week. He thought about what the word network meant when it produced 87 people who showed up without being told why and stood in a government hallway in silence because she had sent some form of signal. He thought about all the rooms he hadn't walked into yet. That night she told him some of it. Not all. She was clear about the shape of what she couldn't say and said so without apology. But some. 9 years. Army. Then a different kind of army. The kind with jobs nations that were letters and numbers rather than words. She named 3 countries in general terms. She described a deployment in Eastern Europe as assessment work and, when he pressed her, expanded it to finding out whether a situation requires intervention before it requires something worse. She told him how the scar on her right shoulder happened, which was a story involving a staircase and a decision made in 3 seconds, told without drama, the way a person tells a story that has been inside them long enough to lose its roughest edges. The one on her left calf, she said, has a less interesting story, but I'd rather tell it when we have more time. He didn't push. He was learning to map her in a new way, the way you relearn a city when you discover it has streets you weren't told about. It didn't make the old map wrong. It just meant the city was larger than he'd been given. The second call came 2 days later. Federal Agent Mirella Dunn from the VA Office of Inspector General, Pacific Northwest Region. She wasn't calling about the hold on Nolan's account. She was calling because the formal complaint Tova had filed had triggered a standard case history audit, and the audit had found something. Quist's 29-month case history showed 61 accounts with classified tier service designations that had been frozen or denied. 53 of those claimants had eventually abandoned their appeals. 7 had successfully appealed. 1, Nolan's, had been resolved in a single morning in a way the audit notation described as atypical. 53 abandoned, Tova said. That's not a normal abandonment rate, Dunn confirmed. No, Tova agreed. It's not. She was quiet for a moment. What's sex involvement? There was a pause. How do you know that name? I've done my reading. Oliver Seck, regional director for the past 4 years. He received an internal compliance flag about Quist's denial patterns approximately 6 months ago. Dunn took a breath. We're still in the preliminary stages. I'm not asking you to confirm anything, Tova said. I'm telling you what I know so you understand how much runway you have. She stepped out onto the back porch and pulled the door half closed behind her and spoke for 7 minutes in a voice Nolan could hear if he pressed his ear to the right spot in the hallway, which he didn't. What she knew, what she had known since filing the original complaint 4 days before Nolan's appointment, the same night she received the freeze notification, was that Kaust's pattern matched something she'd read about in a veterans advocacy bulletin 18 months earlier. a regional cluster of covert classified account denials in the Pacific Northwest, higher than statistical baseline. She'd made a note and kept it. When her own account was frozen, she recognized the shape of the thing immediately. She had filed the complaint before Nolan even went in because she knew that by the time the appointment happened, the complaint would already be in a processing queue. Whatever Quist did in that office would become part of a documented pattern rather than an isolated incident. That was the way she thought, not reactively, in overlapping timelines. The deeper finding took 9 more days. Oliver Seck had received the internal compliance report 6 months ago. He had written a response memo classifying the findings as inconclusive and archived the report without further review. The compliance officer who'd written it had filed a separate whistleblower complaint through an external channel 4 months after that, and it had been sitting at a federal oversight desk, assigned but not yet prioritized, until Tova's complaint arrived and an analyst cross-referenced the 2 filings. Seck's rationale, which the financial forensics team assembled over 3 weeks, was this: classified veteran benefit payments processed through a separate federal reimbursement channel. If they were frozen in administrative limbo, not formally denied, which would trigger an appeals clock, not approved, which would require disbursement, they simply stopped hitting the regional office's budget cycle. 72 accounts over 31 months. An estimated $3.8 million in deferred disbursements that made the office look well managed and within allocation. He had received 2 internal commendations for regional fiscal efficiency. He had been recognized for defrauding the people he was supposed to serve. Piers Daunt called on a Thursday. He used a number she recognized, a prepaid Pacific Northwest area code, different device than before but same rhythm of it. She picked up before the second ring. She hadn't heard his voice in 4 years. He'd been on her team for 3. He'd seen her name in the preliminary federal filings and had spent 48 hours deciding whether to surface. "I've been watching Seck for 11 months, he said. Not because I wanted to, because my account is one of the 72. He'd been denied 19 months ago, abandoned the claim when the 3rd inquiry went unanswered, the way Seck had calculated people would. He'd been paying out of pocket for his medications since, which had meant working 3 jobs in rotation and sleeping less than his body preferred. Give me a secured line, he said, and I'll walk you through what I have." The meeting happened at a federal facility in Portland. Nolan sat in the lobby with his textbook and a packet of crackers from the vending machine. Tova and Piers sat across from Agent Dunn and a second investigator named Calvert, who had the steady look of someone who had done this work long enough to be good at it. Piers was 44. He walked with a slight drag in his left leg that hadn't been there 4 years ago. He'd gotten thin in the way people get when they're working too hard and eating when they can, and his hands on the table had the look of hands that had done more than their share. He laid it out methodically, the way she remembered him doing everything. The routing pattern. Seck's use of the VA's internal demographic database to identify covert classified veterans in the Pacific Northwest and funnel their files specifically to Quist's review queue. The administrative hold mechanism, which existed as a short-term tool for genuine documentation disputes and had been converted into a long-term parking structure for accounts that Seck wanted to make disappear without triggering the formal appeals process. "Why these veterans specifically?" Dunn asked. Piers looked at her steadily. "Because our records can't be publicly defended. If a covert classified veteran disputes a denial, they can't walk into a congressional office and show their service history. There's no accessible history. That's the architecture." Seck understood that the same architecture designed to protect us was also the thing that made us the easiest to ignore. The room was quiet long enough for the HVAC system to become audible. Tova looked at the table. The specific weight of what Piers had just said was familiar to her in the way things are familiar when you've suspected them, but haven't let yourself complete the thought. Seck was placed on administrative leave 11 days after the Portland meeting. The federal investigation formalized within the week. All 72 frozen accounts were flagged for immediate review and expedited processing. Quist, who had operated within a queue, Seck controlled without apparently understanding the full architecture of what he was serving, cooperated with investigators, and was spared the more serious charges, though the formal findings on his own conduct were specific and lasting. His processing authority was permanently suspended, and the 54 abandoned accounts attributed to his review period were being individually reinstated and resolved. Piers Daunt's 19 months of frozen benefits came back as a retroactive payment. He called Tova the day the check arrived. She heard something in his voice she hadn't heard there in 4 years. A quality that wasn't relief exactly, but was what relief leaves behind when the thing you've been bracing for finally stops coming. 3 days after that, a man named Ray Caddo called. He'd been on the list. Denied 26 months ago, his account frozen in Quist's queue, his appeals processed into the administrative hold and never touched again. He was 41. He'd lost his apartment 17 months ago when the monthly costs exceeded what he could sustain. He'd been staying with his younger sister since, sleeping in the spare room his niece used for her art projects. He'd found out about the review from a veterans support newsletter someone had forwarded to him. He asked Tova if she understood what the restoration meant. She said she did. He was quiet for a moment. "My daughter is 7, he said. She's been watching me sleep on a couch for 17 months. She thinks we can't afford a home." A pause. "I'm going to be able to tell her that changes." He stopped, and she could hear the controlled effort in it. "I just needed someone to know what that means. I needed to say that to someone who understands why it matters." She told him she understood it. She meant it without qualification. She testified before the VA Inspector General Oversight Panel in January in a conference room in Washington with the institutional gray light of all such rooms. Nolan had come with her. First flight he'd taken, sat in the hotel the night before finishing a history essay and eating room service fries with the focused efficiency of someone who had inherited his mother's ability to run parallel tasks without making a production of it. She spoke for 2 hours and 11 minutes. About covert classified service records and the bureaucratic architecture designed to protect the veterans who held them, and how that same architecture had been identified and exploited by someone who understood it well enough to turn a protection into a mechanism of selective harm. She was not dramatic. She had the specific flatness of someone being precise, because precision is what the room requires. At the end, a panelist, a woman in her late 50s with the bearing of someone who had outlasted many difficult rooms, asked, "You filed the original complaint 4 days before your son's appointment. Before you knew what would happen in that office. What made you do that?" Tova looked at her. "I'm an ER nurse," she said. 6 years. She let that sit for a moment. In the ER, when you see the first symptom of something systemic, you flag it immediately. You don't wait for the full presentation. By the time the full presentation arrives, someone is usually in serious trouble. She looked at the table between them. What happened to my son's account was one symptom. I recognized the shape of it. I filed the complaint because I've learned that the symptom is never the whole problem. The panelist wrote something down. Outside, Nolan was in the corridor with a paper cup of lobby coffee, his jacket slightly rumpled, his textbook still in his bag because he had apparently decided the corridor was not a good reading environment and had spent the 2 hours instead doing what his mother had always done, reading the room. "How was it?" he said. "Hard." She took the second coffee cup he'd been holding in his other hand, the one she hadn't noticed until now. Useful. She drank it walking to the elevator. "It was terrible." She told him so. He said, "I know. I got 2. They flew home that evening. The Oregon coast was dark when they landed, the Pacific out there somewhere beyond the tarmac lights, doing what it always did. 6 weeks later, on a Thursday night shift, Tova was at the nurses' station at Mercy Regional Hospital at 2:09 a.m., entering discharge notes. The ER was quiet in the way it is when it is not actually quiet. A man in Bay 3 with a blood pressure question, a teenager in Bay 6 with a laceration that needed a second look. The monitors hummed. The fluorescents were the particular shade of white that stops bothering you eventually. Her phone lit up on the desk beside her. A text from Nolan, from his room at home where she'd left him at 7 p.m. doing homework. "I was reading about 18D tonight." She looked at the screen. 18D is the Army designation for a Special Forces medical sergeant. one of the most technically demanding medical qualifications in the military, covering trauma surgery, emergency medicine, and critical care in conditions that have considerably less to work with than an emergency department. She typed back, "And?" He wrote, "I think I finally understand why you're the best nurse at that hospital." She set the phone face down on the desk and looked at the ER, the bays, the corridors, the monitors doing their patients' steady work. She had been here for 6 years. Before that, she had been somewhere else entirely, doing a version of the same thing in rooms that looked nothing like this one and gave her considerably less margin for error. Both things were true. The job she'd had and the job she had now ran on the same training applied to different terrain, and she had not walked away from the first one into the second. She had carried it with her, the way she carried everything, without making a production of the weight. She picked up the phone. "Get some sleep." Then, after a moment, she typed one more line. "Yes, that's part of it." She put the phone in her pocket, pulled up the discharge notes, and kept working. The ER hummed around her. Somewhere down the corridor, a monitor chirped once and went steady. Ray Cato's daughter was going to wake up tomorrow in a home they could afford. Piers Daunt was somewhere in the Pacific Northwest, sleeping better than he had in 19 months. 72 accounts were moving through restoration, each one a person who had served in silence and been failed in silence and would now at least be seen correctly in the record that outlasted everything else. Some things needed to be opened rather than managed. She had known that for years, longer than she had always acted on it. The cost of keeping things small was paid eventually by someone who hadn't chosen to carry it, and she had learned that lesson in the specific, irreversible way that people learn things that actually cost them something, which meant she had stopped waiting for the right moment and started moving when the shape of the problem was clear enough to name. Tonight, the shape of the problem was Bay 3 and a blood pressure question and a discharge summary that needed 2 more sentences. She finished it, closed the chart, and moved down the corridor.